Why wouldn't we be involved in it? Because there's been so much hatred and bloodshed in that part of the world over the last 100 years that it's virtually impossible for us to go in and reconcile all of these parties. In other words, to some extent, it has to be fought out. And I think that's already largely happened. And if we were smart, we would sit down and recognize that this has happened and say enough is enough. How much more blood has to be spilled? I don't think we need to spill any more blood in that region. And we need to redraw the borders. We need to make Western Ukraine, whatever remains of it, neutral. Remember the whole 2 days before September 11th, Rumsfeld comes out saying $2.3 trillion of money's been missing, and you know that whole story of what happened in the 9/11 took place, and hey, weapons of mass destruction. We have to do all of that, and that led to there was no weapons of mass destruction, and that one video where President Bush says, well, you know what's going on right now, and they're trying to take over Iraq. He says, oops, you know, a similar thing. I don't know if you've seen that speech. So, a lot of people are sitting there saying, okay, so who wants this thing to continue? Eisenhower prepped everybody right after he was done saying, be careful with the whole military-industrial complex. JFK was kind of pushing the envelope, saying, hey, we gotta also go through this. Trump was also saying there's no need to go into half these world's wars. Why do we have 780 military bases? But who wants this thing to continue, and who benefits the most if this thing continues? Well, remember that the bases that you're referring to are really a product of the Cold War, and the fact that after the Second World War ended, we were literally the only man standing. Europe was in ruins. The Soviet Union was by no means strong enough to wage a new war. They'd lost. We think now they've lost during the war of 39 million. So, we were the only power. Japan was prostrate. We had to stay in Japan because we had left Japan. It could have become a Soviet satellite. Most of the things that we did after 1945 have to do with communism, containing it, suppressing it, and remember the idea was that you don't confront directly militarily, you contain it until it finally implodes. Guess what? It worked, they imploded. We like to say, well, we caused it, but the truth is the system itself was so dysfunctional, it was going to implode on its own. Totally get it, yeah. So then this ends, and then you have a lot of people in Washington saying, well, we hold all the cards, we're the only superpower. In other words, we're the British Empire after Waterloo. You know, we can intervene everywhere. We can reshape the world in our own image of this man Wolfes who wrote a document in the Pentagon that essentially says, we're going to become altruistic imperialists. We're going to go over there, right the wrongs, make the world safe for us, make it safe for our lives, make it safe for Israel, whatever, you know, go down the list. This was Wolfes. Everybody adopted this and said, this is great because there's no one who can challenge us. Remember Desert Storm? Desert Storm sent a message. Look, we've got things nobody else has. Nobody can take us on. Well, the truth is that everything that we had in Desert Storm as a monopoly has been lost. And all the technologies and capabilities that we had then that no one else did are now everywhere. Everybody's got them. And you can see that happening right now in Ukraine. The world has changed, but we did not. We decided, well, you know, we're going to run this place, and we're going to structure the financial system, the global financial system, to suit us. We're going to use it to force people to do the things we want them to do. And we did it all in the name of this crusading liberal democratic approach. In other words, we're crusaders for liberal democracy. Well, that doesn't hold up to close scrutiny. I mean, let's face it. That's a lot of nonsense. Behind the scenes, you have all of these people invested, in personally and in terms of their wealth, invested in this global structure. We call it security, and the rest of the world looks at it as dangerous American military presence. I don't know that Americans realize that this hangover from the Cold War is primarily responsible for it. But if you have lots of money going into weapon systems, into programs, into policies, into foreign aid that have been going there and going there and going there and going there, you have lots of people on the hill. And you have lots of donors who control the hill that profit from that. They don't want that to stop, and that was Trump's great sin, if you will, in Washington. He's disrupting the money flow. If Trump gets away with this, we're going to go broke. We'll lose money. That was the reason Trump was hated, despised, and successfully subverted, I would add. But we still have to do it. We still have to stop it. And we're up against a group of people in Washington who want to keep it going. Now, when does this end? What did Ben Stein say? It goes on until it can't. And we can debate the true structure of the economy, the underlying fundamentals, which I don't think are particularly good. I'm there with Rackarts and others who think we're headed for serious trouble. But there are lots of people who say, oh no, we can print money in perpetuity and do whatever we want. I think it's going to end when it ends. What happens historically is the empire, the overseas possessions vanish, troops come home, the investments end, and you start over from scratch, and I think that's where we're headed. When it ends, will Putin still be the leader of Russia? Of course, yeah. He's dying of terminal cancer, remember? Right. He was supposed to be dead at least a year or two ago. Right. He'll probably be around. Yeah. So what you're saying is if you're saying when it ends, he's still going to be the leader of Russia. You're saying it's going to end pretty soon. It's not going to be ending anytime soon. You know I don't know. You know the black swan concept. I think there's a pond out there with lots of black swans swimming around. When will one of them take on, if I knew that, I'd be a billionaire. I mean, as rich as you. Does BlackRock want it to continue because BlackRock wants to keep going? Well, I think BlackRock wants to control as much of Ukraine as it can. Monsanto and a number of other firms are all in there because you're talking about some of the richest agricultural land in the world. They weren't soldiers, and in fact, I knew people when I was an exchange student whose grandparents had made the decision to die so that the rest of the family would have food. I mean, that's how bad it was in Germany and Austria. When World War II broke out, what did Hitler obsess over? Ukraine. He wanted to get it, control it, and hold it because of its capacity to produce food. So that tended to distort the whole strategic approach to the war in Russia. That's how important it was, and there's no doubt that people would like to gain control of it. Now, the point is, if it's going to be a neutral place, I don't know if anybody is going to help the Ukrainians sort through all of this so that they are not stolen blind, but I guess that could happen. You've mentioned we have 44 four-star generals today compared to 1 million total soldiers. In World War II, we had 10 four-star generals to 16 million soldiers. Let me recall this: Eisenhower, MacArthur, Arnold, Marshall, Nimitz, Leahy, and King, totaling 7 at the height of the war in 1943 to 44. There were 74 stars in command of a 12.2 million man force. This wasn't an accident, it was by design. Marshall made it very clear that he did not have time to argue with people. As soon as you create another 4-star, you have to argue with the 4-star. Marshall didn't want to be bothered. This changed in January 1945 as the war was ending, and we started promoting people not to positions of greater power but as honorifics. For instance, we made Bradley a 4-star, thanking him for his service. Most of them became 5 stars because they had accomplished such wonderful things. This unity of effort was essential, and Marshall aimed to prevent disarray, similar to the scene in Kubrick's movie Apocalypse Now, where nobody knows who's in charge. So, Marshall and King had a similar attitude to avoid conflicts among the military's top brass. From then to today, we've transitioned from 1.1 million soldiers to 12.2 million in 44. How many of the 12.2 million were drafted? I'd guess at least 2/3, making it around 8 million who were drafted, leaving around 4 million volunteers. What does this stat tell us today? Are our 4-star generals becoming more like politicians than military leaders? Do I feel safer with our current military in the face of advancements by other countries investing in their military capabilities? For the last 100 years, we haven't defended our borders as we did between roughly 1918 to 1948 when the U.S. Army secured the Mexican border and most of the Canadian border. Today, our investments lean towards sustaining overseas interests, contrary to Washington's principle of non-interference in other countries' affairs. These 44 four-star generals seem more like minor satraps, minor emirs, each with their own interests in building their feasts to exaggerate their importance in American national security. This seems counterproductive in a world where instantaneous satellite-based communications render the need for multiple commands unnecessary. We need to reassess our role in intervening in the internal affairs of other countries. I would argue that $7 trillion was lost in the Middle East between Afghanistan and Iraq. That doesn't even begin to address the damage we've done to our own citizens who served in uniform and need medical care for decades. Is this a benefit to us? Where did all of this money come from? Well, I guess we know the answer to that. It came from the printing press. We borrowed it. We need a lot of printing presses for this, though. When looking at the national defense budget, it's give or take somewhere around $840 to $850 billion, okay? Who determines where this money goes? If we were to say, we're going to buy this, we're going to invest in this, who's in the room deciding what we need to prepare for future wars that could take place in 5, 10, 15 years, not the wars fought 10 or 20 years ago? Who makes that decision? Well, you're asking a question about who, but there is no one person making those decisions. There are lots of different people from various armed services and commands, as well as federal agencies that support them, providing input. In other words, they have wish lists and recommendations. Then, there's Congress. Remember, Congress has a very different incentive structure. If you were to tell Mitch McConnell, we don't think we really need Fort Campbell, Kentucky, it would likely offend many, including me. But you understand, say that, and the whole delegation will vehemently oppose it. The building knows that, and the generals in the army know that. They want to maintain the 101st, which, in my judgment, is increasingly an anachronistic organization, especially considering what's happening in Ukraine. What happens to all the helicopters? So, what are we doing with this thing? You could say the same about the 82nd. There's a wonderful book called When Failure Thrives about the failure of airborne operations over the last 60 to 70 years. If that's true, do we need 15,000 paratroopers? We haven't even begun to address the Marine Corps, where Marines are debating their mission. Has anyone decided what the mission for Marines ought to be, and who is actually in charge on the civilian side? The people on the Hill love these headquarters. If you send a 4-star to Tuscaloosa, nowhere Alabama, they'd love it. How much money are you going to spend on the building the 4 stars will occupy, and how many jobs will it create? This is a result of the Cold War, as it created the appetite and opportunity. Our budget was $3 billion in 1944, just looked it up. Now, $3 billion with less than 10 4-star generals. They sit and discuss what to do with this. I wonder when was the last time we had a president who served in the military? It was President Bush Sr., right? That's 30 years ago. Since then, we haven't had a president with military service. W was just in the reserves. How do China and Russia decide where to invest in their military? If we were to list our top 5 biggest enemies, how do they decide where to invest their money? Are their decisions unified, unlike in America where it's political? We're in an era where some argue that today's super soldier is part of the LGBTQ community. It's about trends and learning, right? Imagine the innovation and research done to realize that the best soldiers are from there. But I want to know how my enemy decides their budget. Do they sit in a room fully unified? Do they decide to benefit certain companies for campaign distributions? 30 years ago, we had 50 different military equipment companies. Now, only 5 remain. Why do we need their money for campaign distribution? This concerns me because if our investments primarily benefit a company, we're not truly protecting the country, we're just finding ways to get reelected and receive more campaign donations. You've broken the code, there's no question about it. Let's pause and talk about the Chinese dilemma. People attribute various things to China. They're not magically shipping all the fentanyl to the United States. It's sold to drug cartels by Chinese organized crime, not the government. The organized crime problem in China is massive. With 1.4 billion Chinese, she doesn't wake up thinking about defeating the United States. He wakes up wondering how to stay in power and manage this chaotic mess. I mean, he just destroyed the shadow banking industry in China. That's beginning to have a terrible effect on the economy because shadow banking was the source of many loans necessary to sustain growth. China has a growth problem. They have a huge corruption problem too. A few years ago, they arrested and ultimately executed, as I understand it, the man responsible for shipbuilding because he deliberately oversaw the building of faulty hulls in the PLA Navy. Everybody says, well, it's a 300-ship Navy, but China has outstripped us. 100 of those vessels are Coast Guard vessels. Nobody ever brings that up. Nobody ever brings up the fact that the Chinese don't really like to go to sea. They've just started a submarine fleet that is nuclear and nuclear capable. Well, we've been doing that since the 1950s. It takes decades to build a force like that, to train the people, organize them effectively, and equip them. China has huge problems just holding itself together. So, I think we should set China aside and understand that it is not this juggernaut led in one particular direction. I see it as a nation that has to feed itself, fend for itself. It has to have commerce. A lot of that commerce has to go over land or sea. Those things are real, but that doesn't mean it's bent on war with anybody. Now, let's turn to Russia, which is a smaller entity and easier to understand. I think Putin was responsible for tearing apart, reducing, and trying to modernize the old Soviet military structure. The old Soviet military structure was enormous. They had over 1 million men under arms just in the Soviet army. They had vast stores of equipment, most of which had long since become obsolete. This is the problem when you try to modernize a large force. You can't do it without facing the high probability that 10 years after you've modernized it, it's hopelessly obsolete, and you have no savings to do anything else. So, he tried to make it smaller, and he succeeded. He tried to professionalize it and stop the brutality inside the old army barracks, which was characteristic not just of the Soviet military but also the Tsarist armies. He had some success. Then it turns out that he had to use it, and it was too small for the purpose he decided to use it for. So now it's up to 750,000. There's a plan to make it 1.2 million. Congrats, President Biden. Congratulations, NATO. You've just created the very thing you said you were setting out to stop. Do you understand? In Russia, one man at the top, with the defense minister, has enormous power. He has much more power than Biden, much more than almost anybody else who sits in that position to allocate resources, establish factories, disestablish factories, build new formations, disestablish old formations. Think of Putin not as Stalin but as Tsar. He is roughly as powerful today as the Tsar of Russia was before World War I. That's the kind of power and influence he wields. I'm sure he's under a lot of criticism right now because there are always people in Russia saying, we need a bigger force, we need a bigger force. They border how many countries? How many thousands of miles across is the place? It's legitimate, but he tried very hard to economize. Now he's stuck with the requirement to maintain a much larger, more lethal military force. And the military force,